Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here today and for that very nice introduction. I want to begin by thanking my hosts here in Madison, the Warren Society and Culture Program, the African Studies Program, and the Department of History. And specifically, I want to thank Professor Marissa Moorman, Harry Kiru for hosting us here at the Africa at Noon series, and to John Hall, Mike Martuccio, and Thomas Ryder for making this visit possible. I also want to give a special thanks to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum for supporting this visit. Any commemoration of war or any history of war, I think, has to start from honoring the dead and doing right by the living. And the Wisconsin Veterans Museum does that very adeptly. I went yesterday. If you haven't been, I encourage you to check it out. It's free. So today I want to talk to you about the shadowy thing that is military law. And specifically, I want to talk about what happens when the rules that soldiers make for each other become the rules for society at large. I also want to tell you about dictatorship, about what strong executives think they are doing when they hollow out the states that they govern. African history is often used as a distant mirror for other societies. And I'll start by saying that I object to that in principle. African societies ought to be apprehended on their own terms without comparing them to other places or using them as object lessons for other societies. That is a conviction that has guided the study of Africa as an academic discipline in the United States since its inception, an inception that largely happened here at UW-Madison. I honor that. However, it's harder and harder for me to ignore the parallels between Nigeria's dictatorships and what is happening in my own country. European fascism is not the only form of tyranny in world history that we can use as a foil for our own times. So what I am about to describe to you in late 20th century Africa is something that is distinct and historically specific, but that doesn't mean that it is irrelevant to us. Here is the generalization. Soldiers run countries like they fight wars. They approach every political problem like a battle to be won or lost, even when it isn't clear what would constitute winning or losing for a social question. They treat their rivals like enemies, not people who see things differently, but adversaries who have to be defeated. Combat is their metaphor for just about everything, including many political processes. They divvy their populations up into friends and foes and treat them accordingly. They enforce a particular kind of conformity, and they insist that everyone ought to think like they do. And soldiers have a funny way of thinking about lots of political problems. Now, what I've just described is not true of every military regime, of course. I'm painting in very broad brushstrokes. But the soldiers who took power in African countries after independence were young men like this, in love with their own strength, brimming with ambition and a nervous kind of vitality. These men had revolutionary plans. Nearly all of them were committed to transforming their societies, even though they didn't necessarily agree about what exactly they were transforming them into. Their coups were power grabs, to be sure, but those coups also came with ideas. And once they had mopped up the blood in the barracks, soldiers set about governing. And the ideology that they created, militarism, is one of the 20th century's most neglected and most important ones. A large portion of the world's population lived under military rule at some point in the late 20th century, including large swaths of Africa, also some of the world's largest countries, Pakistan, Brazil, Indonesia, large parts of Southern Europe. This was an extremely important ideology in the late 20th century. And like its better known counterparts, things like communism or capitalism, militarism had a culture, it had an aesthetic, it had a philosophy, it had a theory of time, and it had a complicated libidinal politics that colonized how people thought about themselves and shaped what they desired and how they desired it. For many African countries, post-colonial history is a succession of soldiers' blood feuds with one another and their power grabs, both from civilians and from each other. There were military regimes in every part of the continent and from every former European empire. Even the two countries that had managed to avoid colonization, Ethiopia and Liberia, did not avoid military rule. Both became military dictatorships. There were nearly 200 coup attempts in independent Africa between 1956 and the millennium. About 80 of those succeeded and created military governments. Since then, one of the driving forces of African history has been a struggle between soldiers and judges, the executive and the judiciary, about who made the rules and what those rules should be. This talk today is drawn from a book that was published in October called Soldier's Paradise, Militarism in Africa After Empire. I'll pass it around if anybody wants to take a look. This book interprets the military dictatorships of the former British Empire in Africa through the lens of law and legal history. So these countries would include Uganda, Sudan, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and the largest country of them all by population, Nigeria. Military history and legal history are seldom put in the same frame, but I think they should be. Military dictatorships were not black holes of law. And legal history is particularly good at showing how slippery and duplicitous people can be, something that I think has been lost in the story of independence as we have told it. We have told it as a story of heroes and teeth-gnashing villains. Law gives some more shading to that story. So these are the kinds of documents that a legal historian has at his or her disposal for understanding this era. There are trial records like the enormous inquiry about the dissident musician Fela Kuti in the 1970s. There is reported law like the Matovu decision from Uganda, which paved the way for military takeovers there and elsewhere on the continent. There is commentary on law in law journals and in the press. And finally, there are the administrative records of courts and tribunals. Although I should note that that final category is quite thin on the ground for post-colonial Africa. Military regimes tended not to leave much of a paper trail, and military leaders tended to mistrust the written word for various reasons. So militarism arguably reached its fullest expression in Nigeria, and I'm going to speak a lot about Nigeria today. Nigeria is important for this story, first of all, for the basic reason that its population is larger than all of the other countries of West Africa combined. And second, because its era under militarism was longer than anywhere else. And this ideology reached its fullest, most elaborated form there. So Nigeria was ruled by these 8 officers for nearly 40 years. And many other states in Africa were ruled by men like them. At first glance, Africa's soldier kings look kind of like an unthinking rabble. Men with guns, but no plans, only ideological in the barest of senses. But of course, these men did think, and they did have plans. And although most of those plans failed, they reshaped their societies in important ways, ways that are still visible today, even in failure. So today I'm going to tell you about how these men and others like them reasoned, and why they cared so much about law. Africa's military dictatorships were very legalistic in how they operated. So I asked, what were their commitments and their administrative philosophies? What did they think about human nature? And how did they try to change it, including and especially through law? In Nigeria, these men promised that they would make a bountiful and orderly world. Their revolution, as they called it, would bring a second, deeper, more lasting freedom than the freedom that formal independence from Britain in 1960 had brought. Soldiers promised to restore the honor that colonialism had broken and to strengthen the nation so that nobody would ever conquer it again. They would provide for the poor, which was the class that most of them came from, and they would allow the weak to become strong in a way that the British and the African civilians to whom they had handed over power had allegedly prevented. They had a logic that was profoundly procreative. The army would pluck promising young men out of the countryside and induct them into the ranks. Those men would marry wives who would be partners in the revolution. Their children would be raised to be good soldiers or good wives to soldiers, and the cycle would continue until this revolution was complete. Africa's many peoples would all march to the same military cadence, their differences hidden underneath their uniforms. Militarism was an ideology of rebirth and strength. It offered honor and self-respect to a people humiliated by a century of colonialism. And to true believers in the military project, militarism was beautiful. It offered the splendor of upright backs, polished brass, and billowing flags. Its promises were appealing, including to civilians, and they remained seductive, even as soldiers broke those promises over and over again, which, to be sure, they did. A coup plotter in Ghana named Kwesi Okran wrote in 1977 that, quote, everyone looks to government to lead the country into the paradise that was promised during the period of agitation for independence. But in Ghana, like anywhere else, paradise meant more than one thing. In public, soldiers insisted that they were creating a paradise for the downtrodden. Behind closed doors, they reassured the bourgeoisie that they were building a different kind of utopia, one for them, where contracts would be juicy and capital would flow freely. But what they created was a paradise for neither the rich nor the poor. Instead, they built a ramshackle, dysfunctional utopia for themselves at the expense of everyone else. So military regimes had more of a plan for their societies than they've been given credit for. But I'm telling you this not because I want you to like them. These administrations, by and large, were violent and inept, and their philosophies were often skin deep. When asked about what they believed, generals were liable to start talking about cowboy movies or comic books, to the eternal embarrassment of their intelligentsias. Several of them commissioned actual comic books about themselves as propaganda vehicles, retelling their takeovers as cheerful pows and bangs rather than the bloody coups that they were. I think it wasn't strange that they had this juvenile streak, or that they would think about these things as their guiding philosophies, because many of them were only barely adults. Valentin Strasser was 24 years old when he took over Sierra Leone. Wole Soyinka called Yakubu Gowon, Nigeria's leader in the late 1960s, who was 32, the Boy Scout dictator. An adolescent fantasy gripped Africa while these men ruled it. Perfect freedom. And they had a peculiar idea of what freedom was. Africa's military leaders believed that making their countries into vast barracks was what would make them truly free. In the book, I call this conviction the soldier's creed. And it isn't counterintuitive in at least a certain military habit of mind. Soldiers made a cliche of military life into a political and legal philosophy, namely that discipline is what makes you free. On the battlefield, military-style discipline allows the soldier to unshackle himself from doubt and fear and egotism. And this, he comes to see, is true freedom. And it's a freedom that can only be won by giving up the vanities and petty liberties that pass for freedom in civilian society: what to wear, when to wake up, who to talk to, etc. This is what they believe. My gendered language here is intentional. Militarism was a fundamentally androcentric, male-centered view of the world, even though certain types of women, like patriotic mothers and dutiful wives, had a high status in military societies. The Nigerian military touted the fact constantly that it was the first government that had appointed women to positions of real power in the country. And this was true. Many of the first judges and ambassadors, not just in Nigeria, but in many places, female judges and ambassadors, were appointed by military regimes. But these women, who did exercise real power, still, like everyone else, toiled down rank from the leadership. They knew who they answered to. Soldiers valued discipline as an end in itself. And they saw no reason why this principle, which structured every aspect of their lives, might not serve as a philosophy for everybody. They really believed, with the naive confidence of young men, that they could bend Africa into a shape resembling themselves. If a factory owner ran his business more like an army, he would produce more and waste less. If a woman selling produce on the side of the road could be made to act and think like a warrior, then she would become truly free. No longer a slave of her own bad impulses, discipline would allow her to self-actualize. These were the terms that officers actually used. They were very enamored of pop psychology, and that comes through in their philosophy all the time. And if everyone did this, they argued, then their societies would become prosperous and orderly and truly free in a way that they weren't already. To be clear, they were wrong. And my description of this martial philosophy is not an endorsement of this. And to most civilians, all of this just felt like bondage. A Lagos businesswoman who wrote several memoirs and who I often turn to when I'm thinking about what an ordinary person thought about some dynamic at a given moment, named Kem Liliwhite Wosu, looks back on the military period with undiminished fury from the 2000s. Quote, "The jackboots who ran the country into the ground were blue-blooded aristocrats who spoke with authority through the nozzle of the gun. What they called discipline, I called tyranny." And this was a view that many people shared with her. This idea that discipline is freedom, beloved of drill sergeants or self-help books that are marketed to men, makes for a very illiberal kind of politics when it becomes an ideology. The freedom of rigorously applied discipline feels like no freedom at all to most civilians, including somebody like Kem Liliwhite Wosu. It was this intensely disciplinary ethos that made law so important to military regimes. To put it simply, military regimes wanted to use law as a tool of social engineering and nothing else. But as any legal historian will tell you, it's never that simple. Law cuts in multiple directions. Soldiers and judges were not natural allies. Many soldiers believed that law could be a bridge between the military and society at large. Criminal codes rhymed with their culture of obedience, and rules-based structures like those they found in a criminal code appealed to their sense of order. Many of them believed that judges were their allies, and they put law and order at the center of a lot of their administrative plans. But law didn't work the way that soldiers thought it did. As a disciplinary tool, the courts were unreliable. Soldiers found that civilians could turn law back against them, just as they had turned law back against the British before them. And it was hard to avoid getting tripped up by doctrinal complexities, including those of their own making. Law is a very technical system, and it's one that it's hard to understand if you don't have a training in it, as most military officers didn't. Military officers believed that law was all stick and no carrot, and they were disappointed when they realized that it wasn't always or inherently punitive. Nonetheless, they knew that they needed law, even as they grew wary of it, as they learned more about how it actually worked. They had no problem dissolving legislatures or eviscerating bureaucracies if they believed that they were working against them, but it was much harder to do without a judiciary. Commerce and family life couldn't function without a legal system, and soldiers needed law to implement their revolutions, as they called them. You cannot bring an entire country to heel without magistrates and jails. And so for this reason, judges had the ear of soldiers in a way that no other civilians did in this era. And they were able to criticize executive power, or in some cases to turn it to their own ends as a result of that. The example that many people have in their mind, in the back of their minds when they think about law in dictatorships is something like the Soviet Union. And at first glance, laws in authoritarian regimes might seem ornamental, as law often was in the USSR. In some single-party states, whatever happens in a courtroom, in a show trial, for example, merely endorses the party's dictates. But I want to emphasize that not all authoritarian governments are like this. And in the 20th century, we have many examples of dictatorships that also had vigorous and combative legal cultures, from Pakistan to Zimbabwe, and pretty much all of the places that I'm talking about today. Even the sternest legal orders could be turned against the people who made them. If you make a rope to tie someone's hands, you have to be prepared that your hands might end up getting tied with it, which is a lesson that many dictators learn. There are judges who push back against the military's vision for society. There are legal decisions that undermine the military's lawmaking, and there are guilds of lawyers who plot quietly behind the scenes, waiting for somebody to trip up. Legal scholars who work in the vein of liberal democracies have, I think, been slow to see this, to understand that lawyers might be just as irksome to the state in an authoritarian system as in an open one. So the lesson of all this is not that dictatorships were softer than we thought they were, or more bound by law. Rather, it is that judicial independence does not foreclose repression. And the rule of law is not necessarily antithetical to authoritarianism. A government can delicately hold out the scales of justice with one hand and crack a whip with the other. Military governments recognize the need for public accountability. And they also saw that law could help give them that accountability. But they wanted that accountability to be on their own terms. And so the legal institutions that military governments created were by and large looser and more pliable than the allegedly rigid ones that the British had left behind. The civilian legal system that countries like Nigeria used at independence had, of course, been made by colonialism. And so soldiers called their attempts to change that system, in many cases to gut that system of its protections for civilians, decolonization. Now, this is not the liberation story that most people want to hear. The end of empire was not always a morality play of doomed revolutionaries and the nefarious elites who sold them out. This was a time of strange bedfellows and surprising ideological commitments. And law reveals the ironies of this moment starkly, if not always necessarily clearly. We find British-trained military strongmen borrowing language from anti-colonial radicals. We find committed nationalists arguing that the dusty old English law that had been inherited from colonialism was the only thing that could hold back tyranny. Judges and soldiers shared a rhetorical commitment to the idea of freedom in the abstract, but they very seldom agreed about what that idea meant. Bright moral lines of all kinds became hazy in the courtroom. In this history, we also find a long debate about what law meant. Was it a weapon or a shield? Was it a relic of colonialism, or was it a tool that could be used to disassemble what colonialism had left behind? Of course, as legal historians are fond of concluding, law was all of those things at once. These tensions aren't something to be explained away. They were imminent to militarism as a system of thought and a plan of action. One of the most important of these apparent contradictions or paradoxes is about law. Soldiers ruled by the gun, but they also had a deep and sometimes delusional faith in the power of law to remake their societies. In 20th century Africa, we know the most about a handful of villains, Bokassa, Amin, Mobutu, Charles Taylor among them, and a handful of idols, Nyerere, Senghor, Nkrumah, Mandela, and those of their ilk, and not a lot in between. We have a hero's acre, as Dan Magaziner has called this latter group, and a rogues gallery. The heroes have their detractors and the villains have their defenders, but generally it is this good and evil view of African politics that has animated historical scholarship on the era after independence. The historiography of post-colonial Africa has been told in a way that is very black and white, but a legal historical approach gives it some gray, some shading. Everyone was making compromises in military dictatorships, and there was no point in trying to divvy up the players into radicals and reactionaries or saviors and sellouts. My objective in this project is to convey a point that is uncontroversial among most legal historians, namely that law is neither naturally inclined with power nor against it, into the historiography of decolonization, which has been told in a much more Manichaean way. So let's look at some of this gray. One combative judge, Justice Chukwudifo Oputa of the Nigerian Supreme Court, illustrates the complexities of this era particularly well. Oputa was full of contradictions. He was an ardent anti-imperialist who venerated English law. He was an architect of the military dictatorship who personally disliked men in uniform and did everything he could to avoid them. Most judges keep their cards close to their chest. Oputa did not. He always laid his on the table. In his decisions, he always pointed out the ironies of using English law in a decolonizing society. He hoped for something better, and at moments he believed that martial law might offer an alternative to it. He was a strict disciplinarian, which the military liked, but he also made a lot of decisions against the military in the course of his judicial career, which of course they did not like. He also had a messianic streak that made soldiers uneasy. If anyone was going to act the role of the Messiah, they wanted it to be them. In 1986, in a decision, Oputa wrote that those who broke the laws broke the rules of nature. Quote, nature keeps her books relentlessly and pitilessly. Every generation, a new crop of fools come in. They think they can beat the orderly universe. They are wrong. These are lines from an actual judicial decision. He really had a flair. To Oputa and the soldiers who appointed him to the Supreme Court, principles like, for example, habeas corpus, which might disrupt that orderly universe, were to be treated as relics of colonialism and stripped out of the law. Indefinite detention was, quote, a necessary evil in developing countries, he argued in one important Supreme Court decision from the early 1980s. And to make this point, he quoted a famous line from Frantz Fanon to square his position with the military's larger talk of freedom. The quote was, "We are nothing on earth if we are not first of all slaves of the cause." And, Oputa wrote, being a slave to the cause of freedom sometimes means depriving others of their liberty. Oputa was not the only military ideologue to find the language of anti-colonial or decolonial radicals like Fanon useful. Another example is General Ibrahim Babangida, the dictator who appointed Oputa to the Supreme Court. In 1988, Babangida invoked Ngugi wa Thiong'o's then recent book, Decolonizing the Mind, to justify the military's use of public executions on the grounds that such spectacles were traditionally African. So what are Fanon and Ngugi doing in this putatively right-wing military regime that is remembered certainly not as kind of anti-colonial or radical one? Well, I would argue that this isn't actually as much of a paradox as it might seem. Soldiers like Babangida spoke of themselves very directly as decolonizers. They actually used that word. They weren't the stooges of the British or anybody else. And when they used this radical language, it wasn't because they didn't understand it, as Adam Schatz argues in a recent biography of Fanon. It was because they agreed with it, at least in part, and they found it useful as license to change their societies in the ways that they wanted to change them. Military rule was not a betrayal of some more radical independence that was supposed to happen, nor was it revanchism or counter-revolution. Soldiers did not sell out the anti-colonial revolution, they were the revolution, and virtually all of them saw themselves that way. So did many, though certainly not all, of the people they ruled. In Nigeria, the military's #1 promise to the public throughout all 8 military regimes that existed during this period was that they would restore the dignity and honor that colonialism had broken. And this was a potent promise to people. But to the military, the appeal of returning to an ethical and moral and political world that had been broken by the British was not about rebuilding some unfettered type of freedom, whether individual or collective, which of course was becoming one of the big debates in African philosophy at this time, not coincidentally, I think. Rather, it was about restoring the constraints that were necessary for a harmonious society, which colonialism had loosened. Those restraints would take the form of laws, and this was why military regimes were so legalistic in how they operated. To most military officers, the problem with colonialism was not that it had been too violent or too disciplinary. Rather, it was that colonialism had not been disciplinary enough. And so their vision for decolonization, for what came next, was a vision that embraced penance. For decades, military officers continued to argue that military-style discipline could transform their societies from the ground up, despite evidence to the contrary. Each was convinced that the last regime just hadn't gone far enough. And each believed that the same forces of discipline that had transformed him personally from an unruly young boy into a sharp private could be scaled up into a political philosophy for everyone. And each soldier who took power acted as if he had come up with this idea himself. In Nigeria, discipline was an ethos of self-respect and self-improvement. People should call one another by their proper titles, the military insisted. Not just sergeant or lieutenant, but pastor, prince, Dr., Mrs., engineer. If you've ever been to Nigeria, you will know that its titles, its honorifics are quite grandiose. I think that is largely a legacy of this moment. Women should, quote, respect themselves by dressing modestly, and men should remain fit for the nation by not smoking or drinking to excess. On-the-spot exercise was often the penalty that was imposed for minor infractions of the law. And in this era, it wasn't unusual to see a soldier standing over somebody doing push-ups in the street for talking too loudly or dressing improperly. You still see that occasionally today. Soldiers saw chaos all around them, from official corruption to street crime to the fact that people didn't queue to get on the bus. Bad behavior was a disease that had to be eradicated from the body politic, they said. A sycophantic army poet wrote in the Nigerian Army's poetry journal that indiscipline was, quote, the monstrous beast with human flesh and blood, the poisonous venom in mankind's abode, the sickle cell in the sickler's fragile veins. And the cure that soldiers offered for this disease was a harsh one. Oh, wow, really? Jeez, okay. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And to soldiers, every political problem looked like a war. The most famous of the Nigerian military's wars was the so-called War Against Indiscipline, or WAI, which I think illustrates well what the ideology of militarism looked like in practice. It was a distilled version of the disciplinary tonic that all military leaders prescribed to their publics. The wise official slogan was, "Q, one by one, turn by turn, do not rush. Let us bring a little order into our lives." And indeed, getting people to form queues at bus stops became the military's obsession. The custom, then as now, was to board buses not in an orderly line, but in a kind of rush of pushing, which the military found horrible, found kind of dishonorable. And so to this end, they posted WAI brigade members at bus stops all around the country and armed them with whips and urged them to use those whips on anybody who got out of line, literally. More than anything, it is these whips that the Y is remembered for. It is hard to overstate how radical a policy like this is in a gerontocratic country like Nigeria. What does it mean to give teenagers the right to beat their elders in public? I mean, that is quite a big thing. Even so, the Y was popular, at least among some segments of Nigerian society, which begs a larger question. Why did people put up with military rule for as long as they did? Throughout this period, there were plenty of individual dissidents in military regimes, people who objected to the military's vision. But for nearly 40 years, there was no mass uprising against military rule. Why? I think it was because it gave people a plan, or at least the illusion of a plan. Militarism offered the promise of security and order, even though that remained mostly a promise. Many people saw something appealing in militarism's aggression and austerity and independent-mindedness. Some people found weapons that they could turn against their rivals, which was always an appealing thing. Here is another cold truth. Some people found pleasure in submission. Patrick Wilmot, a Jamaican Nigerian sociologist who made a career out of needling the Nigerian military, argued that his adopted country secretly longed to be dominated. Here's a quote from him, which I warn you is very vulgar. Naive liberals thought people whose noses you rubbed in shit would rise up and try to fuck you, he addressed soldiers. But the truth was they dunked their heads ever deeper in it to hide from the source of their pain before lining up to kiss your dick or crawling away to die. Wilmot's vulgarity landed him in court constantly, as you could imagine, and eventually it got him stripped of his Nigerian citizenship. But there was a grain of truth in what he said. Militarism was humiliating and cruel and vulgar in and of itself. But soldiers' ability to shame and humble people was part of what many people liked about them. The legal forms that soldiers valued most were the ones that they used themselves, as you could probably imagine. They wanted law to be speedy and machine-like and predictable in its operation, just like they wanted people to be. And so to this end, under military rule, a third form of law was added to the already plural system that combined common law and customary law. And this new law was martial law, which applied in this setting not only to soldiers, but to everyone. Military rulers and their jurists argued that military-style tribunals were quicker, more efficient, and better at creating a harmonious society than the civilian legal system. They argued not only that martial law was necessary, given the challenges of the moment, but that it was qualitatively better than other forms of law. Over and over again, the military insisted that the laws that African countries had inherited from Europeans could not advance the good. They pointed to law's jargon as evidence that it was slanted against the common person, never mind that martial law has its own equally perplexing terms of art. And they argue that civilian judges were more interested in procedure merely for its own sake than in adjuring real truths or providing real justice. They accused lawyers of avarice, noting that the only people who benefited from mountains of suits and countersuits were the people who were billing by the hour, attorneys. And of course, they were right about that. The civilian legal system was inefficient. It was stalled. Martial law was offered as the solution to all of these problems. They promised that martial law would be clear and fair and fast, and it would also make the public more disciplined and obedient, more soldierly in effect, which of course was their greatest hope. But of course, martial law was not suited to that purpose very well. Martial law is volatile by design. As a set of rules for warlike young people, it aims to shock them with its caprice and awe them with its force. Martial law offers soldiers a firm hand, and it gives them clarity about their duty, which in situations where you might be commanded to do something like taking a life, which civilian law abhors, is supposed to be reassuring as well as threatening. But there is always the chance that that firm hand might impulsively crush you. And this tension between clear authority and radical unpredictability is one of the things that makes martial law work. But those same qualities that make it work for soldiers make it not very effective as a tool of social engineering for civilians. Martial law is opaque. There aren't a lot of breaks or fail stops built into it. And to the civilians who lived under this system that wasn't designed for them, all of this just felt like tyranny. In 1993, the journalist Christine Anyanwu was arrested for, reporting on a coup attempt against General Sani Abacha. And she was tried before a tribunal called the Miscellaneous Offenses Tribunal for, quote, abetting treason after the fact, kind of nonsense charge. Most charges brought against civilians in these courts didn't make very much sense. Anyanwu left a vivid account of the men who sentenced her to life in prison. Quote, the tribunal comprised a bunch of puppets, puffy men posturing, pompous intellectual dwarves trying to mimic learned court justices. These judges were not in a position to grant justice. It was not theirs to give. Someone else called the shots. Someone else beat the drums. They were dancing to his music, moving to the strings in his hands. And as they played their rules, they looked to the cameras standing in the corners of the hall. Big Daddy's eyes were watching. In his memoir about life in Idi Amin's Uganda, Mahmoud Mamdani made a similar point about how law worked. The fascists played the tune, he wrote, and the judges danced. These metaphors are powerful, but they're also wrong. When they wanted to, judges under military regimes could actually check the military. Courts rendered decisions that undermined soldiers' right to rule all the time, most famously like the 1970 Lakanmi decision in Nigeria, in which the Supreme Court declared that the government was an illegal usurper regime. There were judges who fought heartily against the military's vision for society, such as the Ugandan Chief Justice Benedicto Kiwanuka, who stymied the Amin regime at every procedural turn right up until Amin had been murdered in 1972. Just as importantly, there were small victories that people could win through the courts. Kemlili Waitwosu, the woman I quoted earlier who was so angry about military rule, sued the state over 40 times over the course of her life, over everything from confiscated properties to the time a soldier slapped her in the face at the airport. And she won quite a few of those challenges. Even at the nadir of military rule in the 1990s, when the army infamously executed the environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa after a sham trial, many Nigerians continued to believe that law could offer them something or protect them in some way. Critics of the military made legal forays against it, knowing full well that they would probably lose. But their purpose was not really to win. Rather, it was to push out the boundaries of what was possible, to aim high in the hope that the arrow might land somewhere in the middle, which is something that cause lawyers do everywhere in the world. The successes that they could win through the courts were partial and often pyrrhic, but few Nigerians concluded in this era that law was worthless. I'll leave you with an incendiary question. If someone's boot is on your neck, does it feel lighter if he's your countryman? 20th century African history suggests that it might. To most people in late 20th century Nigeria, it was worse to be ruled by foreigners than to be lorded over by a soldier who might be killed. But this didn't mean that the moral calculus was simple once the British were gone. There was a long tug of war between the army and everyone else over what kind of society was to come. Soldiers and civilians fed each other one day and tried to starve each other out of existence the next day. All the while, sometimes without realizing it, they were building a new kind of civilization, one that held everyone in a tight, disciplinary embrace. And this civilization lasted for several generations. Their Spartan vision was new, and it had no clear analog in the colonialism that had come before them, nor in the brand name ideologies on offer in the wider world in their own times. Soldiers made a form of government that broke the British mold, starting from the fact that they had a role in politics at all. Their culture lasted long after they stepped back from power. You can still feel it and see it today all over the continent. The problem with Africa's post-colonial leaders is not that they were uncreative, as many dissidents at the time argued, and some people still argue today. Rather, it is that it is hard to like what they made. To say that military regimes could be inventive and even revolutionary is not to endorse them. And the bitter pill to swallow is that political creativity of the type that these men had can maim as much as it can heal. Military rule ended in Nigeria in 1999. And until recently, most people, including myself, believed that the era of coups in Africa was more or less over. But the last few years have proven this wrong. There's been a string of military takeovers in these countries and others, and men in uniform are back on the front pages in states from Sudan to Guinea. Nigeria has so far been spared this contagion, but in a way, militarism never really fully ended there. For much of the last 25 years, Nigeria has been ruled by retired generals. Most recently, of course, Muhammadu Buhari, the same martinet who declared the war against indiscipline back in the mid-1980s, who returned to power in 2015, this time through an election. I'm not privy to the army's inner life. Maybe in Nigeria, like other places in Africa, soldiers dream of power in their bunks. The age of military rule in Nigeria has ended for the moment, but the martial spirit is still there. Thanks very much.